Hookah chaka, hookah, hookah, hookah chaka, hookah.
Good evening. You've reached the No Name Cinema Society, the film review show that dares to dig just a little bit deeper. This is episode 82, and tonight we continue our exploration of the films from the Oscar season of 50 years ago, and of course that's 1974. And tonight's film for discussion brings together luminaries like Oscar-winner Jon Voight, acclaimed director Martin Ritt, and novelist Pat Conroy for the film Conrack, based on the latter's book, The Water is Wide. Hi, everybody. My name is Jonathan Betzler. I'm one of your hosts here for the evening, and I've got a couple co-hosts that I'm going to introduce you right now. First, the cranky old superintendent of sound for the No Name Cinema Society, who is incredulous about our ability to succeed. Ladies and gentlemen, straight from Boulder, Colorado, Matthew Polis is here.
Hello, Jonathan.
Maddie, thanks for coming back to us. Also with us, ladies and gentlemen, the idealist newcomer to our society who's going to shake things up and try to get us to rethink the stringent way that we do things. Andrew Garrett's here from Los Angeles, California.
Hello.
Welcome, Andrew. Andrew, Maddie, Andrew. These guys are in different cities, so they're meeting for the first time now. Before we get into the movie, as we've been doing the last several episodes, some quick notes on tonight's song that opens and closes the show. It's one of among the more famous songs from 1974, made so by its catchy Ooka Chaka opening and its inclusion in Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs. It was originally sung by B.J. Thomas as a country single, but it wasn't a huge hit until the Swedish band Blue Swede recorded it in 1974. One of two bands from that country to hit it big in the States that year, the other, of course, being ABBA after their Eurovision win. The song Hooked on a Feeling was the 20th biggest song of 1974. So now the question is, have you guys heard that song before?
Mm-hmm.
You guys are both familiar with Hooked on a Feeling? All right.
Yes.
That's one of the few times that's happened on the show that someone knows the song that opens and closes our show. So I feel good about that. All right, it's time to move on to the summary. I'm just going to give the audience a quick summary of the plot of tonight's film. In case they didn't watch it, if you're watching this review, you probably watched the movie, but just in case, give you a little tidbit, little taste of what's going on. The film is Conrack. Before he was a best-selling novelist, Pat Conroy was a teacher, and one of his first assignments was on an isolated island off the coast of South Carolina, which was a predominantly black community and children that knew more about fishing than they did the ABCs. As a white idealist, Pat takes it upon himself to reshape the young minds, to give them the chances that their fathers and mothers didn't have. But as you might suspect, in the South in 1969, he would run into friction on all sides. So that's my little summary. The next little bit is opening thoughts, in which each of our panelists are going to share a one-sentence review of the film, like did they like it and why. Very, very brief opening thoughts. And Matt Polis is a veteran, so he gets to go first.
All right, I say about this movie, the interactions between Conroy and his students are often very enjoyable to watch, but it also feels like a film of its time and may not land with modern audiences.
Okay, we're definitely going to dig into that a little later. All right, Andrew, that's about how it's done. Maybe that was 2 sentences, so maybe you can do even shorter. Andrew, your opening thought.
I appreciated it for the rawness of the performances of the children, and I thought a standout message and performance from Jon Voight as well.
So Andrew's going to want to dig into performances, and he is an actor by trade, for those who don't know. My opening comment is solid, interesting, and well-meaning entertainment with some question marks. So, it sounds like we're all dancing around the same kind of thing. Like, nobody hated the film, but nobody's ready to say that it should have been nominated for any awards. So with that in mind, I was going to start in direction, and I wonder if, but Andrew brought up performances, so I'm going to skip ahead and talk about performances. And Andrew, you brought it up. I'm going to, instead of reading off my script, I'll let you start us off with the performances. Why did you like Jon Voight?
I just found it very enthusiastic and genuine. It sounds kind of trite to say, but I didn't see much Jon Voight in it. I know it is a 50-year-old movie. I found him to be really vital and full of life throughout it.
I'm not sure it's the performance of the movie to me, and we'll get to that in a second, I think.
Sure.
But I will admit, as a non-Jon Voight fan, he's as good as I've ever seen him in this movie. confident is the word I use. You talk about the energy and what he's bringing, but he really owned this part, I think, in a way that was very transparent, especially with the long, wordy speeches and channeling the film's loquacious professor, carrying both his intelligence and his rebellion. He talks about the white man's guilt sometimes throughout the course of the film. That's what drove him to the island. But it would have been interesting to see how that guilt affected him emotionally now and then. He's sort of playing it as clearing debt, or a clear debt, water under the bridge and in the rear view mirror. It might have been interesting if some of those aspects of his former character threatened to return. As it stands, he's a little too perfect, full of beautiful poetry and righteous indignation. But other than that, less put on than a lot of the other performances I've seen in his career, including one from him in 1974 in which he attempts a very poor German accent. Matty Polis, Jon Voight.
I thought he was great. It felt very authentic and organic. And therefore, when he was charming, he felt charming. And when he was serious, he felt serious. I felt he really, like you said, embodied the role. And so if you separate what he's saying, like the script, from how he's performing, I think it was spot on. And then you could say what he's saying, like you're saying, didn't dive into whatever. That may or may not be his fault. So whatever came out of his mouth felt very authentic and good.
And I wonder, Andrew, if will agree with this, because I'm going to let him rebut what I said in a second. The script talks about the racism that he felt as a youth. So the script gives him that. So I think it's incumbent upon the actor to maybe show that side of it, or play that backstory to some degree. You know, like if he gets frustrated at times, like I felt like, you know, like it can't leave him completely. It's not a switch you turn on and off. So I admit that aspect of the performance I felt like was missing.
You're saying there may have been more of an element of guilt or regret about how he was,
or even a relapse now and then, or moments
even like a relapse into it. He was just a little too perfect. Yeah, and I wonder how much that his performance, because like Matt was saying, what he was going for, I thought really it seemed genuine. That might have given it like another layer that it may have made it a little more nuanced.
I am agreeing with you guys that it's a good performance. I am thinking directorially, like I'm looking at the text and saying like there were opportunities for him as an actor. I do think the writing talks about the backstory. It gives him the opportunities. And I'm not saying he should have a speech or he should snap at one of the kids. If you are born learning that, like that, you often talk about racism as something that is learned behavior. He's not that old. He's not 50. He's a non-racist for a short period of time, probably for a shorter period of time that he was a racist. He's self-described. You wonder that there might be sometimes struggles, just like an alcoholic might or something like that. Some of those old prejudices coming to the fore now and then. I would want to add that layer because I do think it makes it more comprehensive. Maddie, is what we're saying making sense at all to you?
Yeah, actually, like we were saying a lot about how even though there's not a scene for it that was like on the page, he could have infused more of that. For the two scenes that come to mind as you're talking, even in hindsight, don't really feel like he was doing that. The one is at the beginning when the principal came in with the belt, and then he was like looking at it and like hit his own head and like threw it over to the side. That could have been a moment for like some introspective, maybe like reflection. And the other scene was when the whiskey guy attacked him from the shack, and like he got physically attacked. Remember that?
Yeah, absolutely.
He could have had a moment there, where as opposed to what he did is he just acted like it was like rough housing with his sibling or something. It didn't seem threatening at all or flashbacky or anything, you know. So that could have been an opportunity, and the belt thing could have been an opportunity. Those are the two that came to mind that didn't really happen in the way you're describing.
I also thought about the possibility that maybe it resurfaced more with adults. Like I think it's easier to be non-racist with kids potentially because they're so helpless already, but maybe in his dealings with Black adults, you know, whether it was, you know, the teacher, the other teacher in that school, or the principal, or, you know, whatever, some confrontations with her, you know, some of that prejudice might have resurfaced, and that might have been an interesting color. It sounds like we're in somewhat agreement on this. So whether it's Martin Ritt or Jon Voight, you know, like it felt like it could be, it's good, but could be better.
Yeah. I totally understand what you're saying.
So for me, I alluded that there's another performance that I think is really special in the movie, and the film is blessed with one of the great all-time supporting actors in Hume Cronin, who to me layers this ultimately racist superintendent in an extremely evocative way. Throughout his career, he gives his villains, or at least his antagonists, all these extra dimensions that simultaneously make them more interesting and more of a challenging obstacle. Brute Force comes to mind, which we talked about in our 1947 in review show. In his skillful execution, I think you can see the disappointed idealist that perhaps his character once was. maybe finally and thoroughly broken by the deep-seated racism that surrounded him, to the point that he not only fell in line, but now perpetrates the abhorrent attitudes. One gets the sense that it's less the kids and black people that he hates than it is the trouble it will cause him if he rocks the boat too much, which is an interesting color to me. That's why I thought in a smaller role, Hume Cronin, one of the great all-timers from my perspective, really brought a lot to the table in this movie.
The scene where they're trick-or-treating and they come to his house was, I thought, kind of disturbing, I guess is the word, but also made the performance, the character, you could see it moving behind his eyes, having to navigate that situation, right? No, I thought it was a really good performance, because I think a character like that runs the risk of turning into this kind of one-note mustache twirler or something like that. It didn't feel like that.
Matty P. Hume Cronin.
I thought that most of the actors, including Jon Voight and then the other lead, the principal, and that they're all pretty flat, with the exception of this superintendent.
Yeah, I think he was called a superintendent.
Yeah, I think so.
I also think that it's not necessarily a character arc in the traditional sense. He's more of like a spiky graph. And so when he was on screen, I always believed him, and I always thought he was doing a great job. I didn't know which version of him I would get. Even when I thought it was in the right context for me to assume one or the other, he would be like super likable and a kind of father figure, and then he would turn into this sort of like villain character who's nasty and despicable. And then that one scene, I guess, in the Halloween was really good, because it was the dual nature of him behind the eyes. I liked how you said that. So he was the most dynamic character. I just didn't know. Sometimes it threw me how different he could be from scene to scene. It was a little bit stark, but otherwise I do agree he was the most dynamic character.
I do want to talk about some of the things that Andrew talked about. So I'm going to disagree with Andrew, because for me, I think if there's a weak link in the performances, it's probably the most forgivable, in the sense that the kids feel a little self-conscious on camera to me and not always natural. I think Andrew used the word raw as a positive, and they were mostly local, real kids. To me, it showed in a way that distracted me.
Yeah.
It doesn't show up as much as group scenes as it does when any one of them, including Mary, have any solo moments. Getting performances out of kids is famously one of the great challenges, and we often don't marvel enough when it's done well. There was something noble and maybe even in vogue about casting real kids, something about capturing verisimilitude, but it wound up backfiring because I didn't quite believe them. It's the smallest quibble, and like I said, kind of understandable, but also kind of worth mentioning, especially because Andrew brought it up anyway.
By raw, I meant I was kind of like fascinated. Like, it kind of engaged me in the movie necessarily.
Oh.
Even though I didn't necessarily believe them, I kind of agree with you. It made me lean in a little bit. Like, this is a weird movie. Like, above all, it's kind of a bizarre movie. So I suppose I enjoyed it from kind of like an experimental
or like almost historical, anthropological point of view. It
was almost like that kind of fascinated me more with the movie than like thinking like, wow, these are some amazing performances from these kids. Even though I did think a lot of them had good, genuine moments. There was some, of course, parts where you could really tell they were not actors. They were just kids.
And I'll use this opportunity to promote the next show we have coming up. So if you want to see great child performances, see the next 1974 film that we're going to talk about, and I'll tease that at the end. Matty P., the kids.
I didn't have a problem with the kids as much as you seem to. I thought the one girl that became his like
Mary, I think.
Yeah, I thought she was pretty good. She had the sort of range. She was definitely like separate from the group, not only physically, like she came in and out, but like she was a different type of person. I didn't have a problem with the kids.
There are moments that worked, but for me, there were enough moments that didn't. You just hope as a director that you don't have moments that make you self-aware that you're watching a movie. You want to be engrossed, and there were moments that I wasn't, because I suddenly was aware that these were not actors and they were not the characters that they were portraying. Self-consciousness is the main thing that I kept seeing, as you often get with kids.
Yeah.
My original order was direction, performance, screenplay. Doing my favorite working way down, because I do like Martin Ritt, and I'll get to that. But Maddie brought up something about the screenplay, so just the most natural thing to talk about next. True story or not, this film to me has all the earmarks of the traditional inspirational pedagogue movies, complete with its oh captain moment, in line with tradition that dates back to Goodbye Mr. Chips and continued through Stand and Deliver and, of course, Dead Poet Society. But there's something all those movies have in common. They are, Conrack fits into this as well, decent movies. One unique quality to this piece is that it's autobiographical, hence certain elements feel like they could be embellished. Then again, knowing his other works, if anybody would talk like that in real life, it's Pat Conroy. Structurally, it's mostly anecdotal, which is fine on some levels, but also, as Maddie referred to, the seeming lack of arc for Pat might have robbed the film from some additional impact, my perspective. And that's the danger of the lack of perspective that you get with autobiographies, especially ones of such recent history. Like this is only 5 years after it happened to this young man. Does Pat learn that he can't change the world, or that his teaching methods were more for him than they were for the kids? Dead Poet Society worked because the students had the journey. But here they're more of a pack. I suppose you could argue Mary was meant to play that role, and she does have the film's primary arc if you look really closely at it through a magnifying glass. However, her scenes are extremely limited and thus can't really compare to, say, how Ethan Hawke's character finds his voice in Dead Poet Society. So it's not an apples to apples comparison, but I kept thinking about it, especially when it came to think about screenplay. Maddie Polis, you alluded to this, so I'll turn to you here.
Yeah, I mean, I what you just said was stuck out is that it's not about the kids' arc at all. Like maybe they had a nice semester, but they are still there, and he leaves, and it's more just like he comes and goes, and he seems to have a little bit of not a growth moment, but just like a slap in the face moment, and then he moves on. Character-wise, he remains about the same, as does the principal. I thought that was kind of more interesting. I mean, we're traversing like characters and scripts and stuff, but the thing I noticed about her, she described the kids at the beginning as not as uneducated, but as slow, which is very different and very poignant. And I just thought something to point out, capping their capabilities, not just like, well, they haven't been exposed to anything, so go have at it. They're like, they won't do anything no matter what you do. That was what she was implying. And so she didn't have any like glimmer of hope or interest in their success, even as the principal bringing in a teacher or whatever. She wasn't like into it in a kind of telling or interesting way. But her arc, talking about arcs, didn't evolve either. By the end, if there was sort of any sort of systematic change that might have had effect on the small community, it didn't, because she was unaffected. Even at the very last scene, I think her last scene was like, she said, we had our ups and downs, meaning like we connected once or twice. And then he was just like, mind blown kind of face, like, what are you even talking about? She didn't even really evolve either. And so the arc of the movie is, for these characters, are pretty flat all around.
I understand it's a true story, but I mean, like, you still want to find an arc, you know what I mean? Like, it's a movie. And I got the sense that Conrack, at his next position, no matter where it was, he was going to do the same thing and approach it the same way. A failed arc is okay, but you need to like have the breadcrumbs to say that he might change and then chooses not to. You know what I mean? Like, that didn't happen either. It felt awkward in that sense. Not bad, because individual scenes are entertaining enough. Final analysis, there's something empty about that lack of arc to me.
Yeah, I did find something you said, Jonathan, is that in some of these other movies, Stand and Deliver or Dead Poets or whatever, it's about the individual arc of the students, I suppose. This movie, it follows those same points as those ones did, but it all really ended up being about him mostly. And and like we're saying, he doesn't have an arc, and I found myself thinking that at the end of the film was like, oh, it was all really kind of about him, and there isn't a true, he starts one, and gets somewhere. So I don't know. That's kind of what stuck with me, I suppose, through it.
I guess you could say the film is his name, like it's called his name.
Yeah,
so it is about him. But what it might use, and maybe it had and I'm forgetting, but at the end when he goes away, like a coda, like a little text saying, and then he did this at another school or something. Like it just sort of ends. And I feel like maybe it needs a little bit of an after story, which is what you're alluding to, Jonathan. It's only 5 years later, but 5 years had passed, and maybe there's some like notion of a next chapter for his life, because I'd like to know. And at least it would
the next chapter is he became an award-winning successful novelist. That was his next chapter.
I don't know. It's like he made an attempt and it failed, and then he went away. So what is the point? What's the main bottom line?
This is brainstorming. I love this, guys. Like this is us being creative people brainstorming. What you're saying is make me think maybe the arc is he decides teaching's not for him, and he's going to write. He's going to focus on his life as a creative writer because maybe he's not meant to be a teacher. So maybe that's the arc. Or maybe this inspires him to write that, and maybe we needed to see that somehow. That might have fulfilled that gap that we're all seem to be perceiving. There's something cynical about that as an arc, like, oh, and he decides to quit teaching. But it's an arc, like it's a change, like that would qualify. And sometimes there are powerful movies that have it sort of a negative, pessimistic arc.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I guess, and you were saying, Matt, what's the point of the movie, I guess, that this guy, even though he ultimately didn't, I think someone said failure. I don't know if it's that, because I think the point is he did leave these children with more power than they had before.
Or at least promise of potential or something.
Power may be the wrong word, but power through knowledge or
I guess
an ability to see things differently. I don't know if that quite qualifies as a point of a movie, but when that last very long lingering shot of all the kids on the dock, that's what I was thinking.
But I felt sad at that moment. I felt like maybe they had a little bit, but the infrastructure that was in place was blocking them from
absolutely
exploring that further.
I don't think they were left with more power or knowledge. I have a problem with that part of the movie, but they were left with some respect. And I think that's what they were learning from him the most, day-to-day respect as humans, and not just kids and not just black kids, but people for that duration of the semester, at least from that one person. They didn't get it from the principal. They didn't get it from their homes. I have no idea, but that's what he gave them. That might have a lasting impact further in the future than who won the World Series in whatever year.
Yeah, right.
In terms of what you said about the title, Matt, I just want to follow up on that, because it's not his name. And I think there's something poignant about that, because it's not, you could argue that maybe it wasn't meant to be about him. It's about their perception of him, because that's what the title is. The title of the book is "The Water Is Wide."
Right.
So Pat Conroy had a different idea of what the title should be for whatever reason.
Also, okay, so let's talk about his name for a second. So his name is Conroy, Pat Conroy. Yeah. The principal calls him Pat Roy.
Pat Roy.
And then the kids call him the right name sometimes and Conrack other times. So weird, the title of the movie highlights the one, I think, small sliver of his name of the movie. It's not like it was a big deal. I think the bigger deal is what the principal decides to call him the whole time. The kids call him, I think, back and forth, correct and incorrect versions of his last name. Yeah. I don't know why Conrack was extracted as the title.
I don't know. I mean, there might be something about how Jon Voight, being a major movie star at the time, shifted focus potentially in either the screenplay or the edit or something like that. I don't know that for a fact, but that possibility exists. Maybe there were more for the kids to have more of an arc like those other comps that we talked about, Stand and Deliver, Poet Society. One last little tidbit before we get to direction is the other comp that I mentioned that may be a little too old for these guys, 1939, Goodbye, Mr. Chips. It is the teacher that has the arc in that case. It takes place over 50 years, so we see the teacher get older in age, but he goes from being a really strict teacher to showing how compassion could actually have more of an impact with his students than the strict way that he started out at a British boarding school. It was made into a musical as well with Peter O'Toole. That struck me as the exception to the rule that the rest of us are talking about, where the kids are the ones. And I've been hinting all night that I wanted to talk about Martin Ritt a little bit. So just for context, mostly for the audience, these guys might know, Martin Ritt rarely gets mentioned as one of the all-time greats. But any cursory glance at his filmography, and you see a remarkable career of excellence and consistency. In working on my book of the greatest performances of all time, it was striking to me how often Martin Ritt's name kept coming up as directors of these great performances. His background was as an actor in the theater, then directing for stage, and then moving on to directing for television that led to his feature career, which started fairly significantly with a still biting racial drama, Edge of the Night, starring John Cassavetes and Sidney Poitier, both early in their respective careers. What follows is a long list of films that are very much admired, though frequently more for performances than his work, perhaps unfairly. In chronological order, you've got The Sound and the Fury, HUD, The Spy Who Came in from the Cold, The Great White Hope, Sounder, The Front, Cross Creek, Murphy's Romance, Nuts with Barbra Streisand and Richard Dreyfuss. Part of the reason I think Ritt doesn't get the flowers of some of his contemporaries is that his filmmaking choices don't really call attention to themselves. This film, I think, is a good example. But he continues to be a reliable storyteller who avoids pomp, circumstances, and unanastic flash, but still manages excellent detail in immersing us into whichever world he is exploring at that time. While his frames in this film don't call attention to themselves, they are often well-chosen, appropriate, and almost never repetitive. That last part is really important, especially in this film that is shot so much in a small classroom. I think he shot the heck out of that classroom in a way that was very, very evocative and effective without going to the same shots over and over again. Matty Polis.
I don't know that filmography the way you do, or even at all, but I would say from this movie, I would describe him as, and from what you're saying, as a functional director. He's servicing the script, and he executes the script confidently and capably. But there's nothing that would be like, oh, I want to watch his next movie. Like, who's he in this case? But I'm not looking at it as the director. I'm looking at it as a story. And if the next script he directs is interesting to me, I'm sure it'll be competently directed. But as opposed to, say, like David Fincher or someone like that, who's clearly, or, Wes Anderson, to name one of your favorite directors of all time, you'd be like, I don't care what his next movie is. I will watch it anyway because of the director. That's not what you're going to say about this director, probably.
Well, except I might, because like I am one to appreciate this, like the workman-like style, which you like the one that focus on the beats of the scene instead, and the story. Like William Wyler is one that I always point to, but Martin Ritt fits in that category. But also, if you look at the filmography, it just becomes all the more impressive because so many of those films feature tons of acting Oscar nominations. HUD and Norma Ray both won Oscars for acting. Paul Newman did not win for HUD, but probably should have. That is the best performance of his career. So as a director, he's doing something right for that level of consistency. And the beats of the scene are often real and excellent and nuanced. Obviously I have some notes for him. There are things that I wish there were more explored that we've talked about in the performance section, but I on one hand I want people to start acknowledging Martin Ritt as an accomplished filmmaker. There's something to me that's really good about not calling attention to yourself the way David Fincher and Wes Anderson do. Like you're always aware that you're watching David Fincher and Wes Anderson. Martin Ritt's films blend together, but I like that, because his attention is on the story. That's his job.
You can say that's the job of every director, and they just decide to put more or less of their personality into it. I think it's kind of inspiring because I think as a director, and especially going through film school and stuff, you kind of assign the role of director as like this personal artistic mission to make it a flashy example of your artistic tastes or whatever, and that's fine. A lot of directors do that, but you don't have to make a good movie. And I think it's a nice way to see how movies can be made without the director's fingerprint on every scene.
It's the same thing that I always say about William Wyler is he adapts his style to the films rather than forcing one style onto the story. Andrew, what did you think about his work as a director? And did you know any of those other films that I talked about?
Yeah, I've seen HUD, I've seen Ombre. Like Matt was saying, I know many of his movies, and I was kind of like, oh my God, this same guy. But I haven't seen a ton of them. I've always been fascinated by those directors whoever this guy who made this, whereas some directors, it's them immediately. And I've always toyed with which one I preferred or which one I found more impressive. Adapt to the movie, not the other way around. In looking at his filmography, I just was kind of struck by that.
The only thing that's really consistent, and we all talked about the performances in this one, is great acting. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
all of these films, there's some great acting.
It's like they're constantly getting these crazy performances, so they're doing something correct, like that you can't really deny it,
Time to move on to Matty P's favorite section. Andrew has no idea what's coming. Matty P, what do we call it?
Themes.
We call it the T word. Our founding member, Drunk Davey, did not used to like to talk about themes. He said it made movie watching feel like homework. And so he didn't like to talk about it. But the rest of us that did, we danced around it, called the T word. A segment was born. Because there's an obvious theme here that to talk about first, and that obviously there's racial themes. I've been trying to get Andrew on the show for a while, but he was not the original person that was going to do this show. And it's so the person that was going to do this show canceled at the last minute because they were not comfortable with the theme of race in the film. They did not want to talk about it. What Maddie and I discussed is this feels like the perfect venue. The next question becomes, obviously, we are all white men in this situation talking about race, but we're not talking about race. We're talking about our reactions to this film and its relationship to race. That doesn't make it overarching. We're not affecting policy at all. We're just three moviegoers that are reacting to a film and how it made us feel about the racial situation in the South in 1969. This is the kind of film that wears its main theme on its sleeve. And the right arm of this shirt, if you go with that metaphor, is obviously going to be racism and its connection to socioeconomic status. The film mostly doesn't play blatant discrimination so much as it does the effects that had over the years. And it does so in a two-pronged way. First, it doesn't take much inference to recognize that the extreme poverty of the community depicted is a result of years of first bondage in that area and then a system that blocked their ability for advancement. And the second is a result of the years of racism as the fish out of water element for Pat's character, as in the separation and segregation made Pat seem like he came from a different planet and vice versa. Their initial reluctance to connect with him, their distrust, their potentially intentional mispronunciation of his name all stem from generations of learned skepticism based on the way their ancestors were treated. Add to that, too, Pat's aforementioned racism, and we get a microcosm of what the filmmakers perhaps feel was necessary, a meeting in the middle in some way, shape, or form to ease a century of tension. Maddie P. mentioned modern audiences, and that leads to the issue that some modern audiences will bestow upon the film, and I think the person that canceled her involvement in this podcast was thinking about, and that is the film's relationship to the white savior complex. This seems like the prime example of what they're talking about. But then again, if not someone like Pat Conroy, then who? I find myself connecting with Conroy a little bit as I taught middle school in South Central last year, and I'm teaching high school in downtown LA this year. And I can't help but feeling that I could do more good in these communities than I would if I were teaching in more affluent areas. Does that make me disingenuous somehow? I'm not sure. It's a complex issue, and I suppose that's why I might hope for a more nuanced and perhaps less self-congratulatory film. Maddie P., you brought it up a little bit first.
Well, one question I had was regarding the white savior concept. Someone lived it, presumably is retelling it in somewhat of an accurate way. This is what happened. Is it in the same category as a white savior movie? Even though the building blocks at the end of the day are the same, you could look at it that way. But since it actually happened, isn't it more like kind of what you're saying? I did this thing. I felt like I might have had some impact. I'm going to tell my story about it. And therefore, does it have a different, like, should we be talking about it differently, or does it not matter the genesis of something like this?
Then the question becomes, Pat Conroy, being in a place of privilege, is able to tell his story. But who is telling the story of those kids?
Right. It's not this movie. I think we said about in your own teaching experience, and maybe you can have more impact than you could otherwise. And therefore, what's wrong with it? Your personal experience in the world, doing something that has a positive effect on the people around you is one thing. And the other thing is, if you're making a movie to sort of broadcast shared reality, that has a different maybe responsibility than how you do something with your small community. Even if at the end of the day, you can look back and say there's similarities in the Venn diagram between the populations and the demographics are the same. The movie is sort of saying this is how things are. More people are seeing it, but it's also implying a broader reality. And then that's probably the misstep of a movie like this.
I do wish it didn't lionize Conrack as much. You know what I mean? I do wish there was more flaws in him. He wants to tell his story, but like there is something like, I did this great thing and I was helpful and they blocked me. Like it is effective in suggesting what we talked about earlier. The infrastructure is not in place for him for any white person or any teacher to succeed in inspiring in that way. There is a lot about how great he is. You know what I mean? Like he is portrayed and played as this hero. And I wish there was a little more nuance in that. They talk about his past as a racist, but we never see it. You know what I mean? It's just talked about. And that's sort of why I was addressing those things. That might help that perception of this being this white savior thing. Andrew, sorry, we've been talking a lot, but the floor is now yours.
No, I'm fascinated listening to, and I agree with more or less with everything. And just, to reiterate it, he is, and I'm thinking about it now again, pretty much portrayed as perfect. Like every single situation with like such grace and like humor and impact. But it's just something I just kind of thought of now. He doesn't save them. I think just telling the story, albeit a little bit probably with rose-colored shades about the man, it's lionizing him, like you said, but it's also just about a man who seems to have been trying his best to make an impact.
I think you made a great point. He fails. I mean, I think that speaks to something I'm going to talk about in the next theme.
That's a critical piece, I think. You consider the antagonist of the villain, but really he's just the sort of like the assistant to the villain, which is the system and the systemic problems that arise. And so you could say this entire movie, although it has the sort of all the place settings for a white savior, really the villain is the system, and the system wins. Even with the most perfect protagonist doing the best possible thing in his eyes, still doesn't make a dent. And even in the principal of the small school had no hope to begin with and no hope at the end. And it's sort of like, that's the disappointing, depressing reality of this community.
That's a really good point, and it's a really good segue to my next topic. Andrew, you okay if I move on?
Absolutely, yeah.
I talked earlier about the right sleeve, the wearing their themes on their sleeve, and I talked about the right sleeve. So the left arm, the left sleeve of the metaphorical shirt of themes that I mentioned earlier, to me is about the importance of education, compassionate and empathetic teachers, and a system that was not equal in terms of education between the races. So I mentioned earlier that the system blocks the advancement of the Black community, going out of their way to keep the poor poor, but they also limit their access to a quality education. And part of what this film tries to suggest is that the powers that be gave up on this community due to the combination of them being poor and Black. The film goes out of its way to show that even these forgotten kids have potential to do so much more than inherit their family's small plot of land. Not that there's anything wrong with that life, but they are robbed of choices. And it's not just education in general, but the specific type of education. And this is another thing that I identify with. Pat is hell-bent on not just teaching them facts and ideas, but teaching them how to think, both concretely and abstractly. Interestingly, his failure in this community echoes that of Robin Williams' character in Dead Poet Society, albeit in a very different economic environment, as we go back to that comp. Both men inspired students when trying to connect with them on their level, trying to encourage their own ideas and creativity, and both men were pushed out of their jobs as a result. This suggests a flaw in the educational system that continues to this day, in my experience, one based on numbers and test scores, an assembly line situation that may have a handful of success stories, but leaves too many far behind to be considered a viable system. And the onset of AI in our modern world only stands to make things worse. And I'm going to let Matt go first again, because he has some kids that are going through the educational system. So Matt, that's what I have to say about teachers, education, etc., as my other theme of this film.
Very nice, Jonathan. So you're talking about how the system is sort of unfairly set up. It's totally true. But I would point out in this movie, actually, one of the things that struck me and made me uncomfortable watching it at various times was how the community itself was against itself. And it's almost like this learned helplessness over time, which was more provocative in terms of their situation than like the school system not giving them resources or whatnot. It's like I said at the beginning, the principal described her own kids not as undereducated, but as slow, which is completely inaccurate and self-defeating. By the end, she still didn't have any interest in them succeeding. Even though he's doing all these things, she was at the end like, no, I don't really care, in not so many words. And I feel like that shows the weight of the generational position they've been in, that they just a learned helplessness, and their own lack of motivation is more telling than maybe
that's created by the system, right? I mean, I agree, and
of course, yes.
The system makes those people self-defeatist to some degree. I think that was the word you used, or I'm paraphrasing. The system crushed her. The system potentially crushed the superintendent. At least that's something I'm inferring. Those hopes and idealistic dreams that Pat has, if he stayed in the system, maybe he would have lost as well, potentially. The structure of the system creates those people. There's a distrust. Anything that the school district is going to do, they're wary of, just because they've been burned so many times.
Let's say in this movie, someone said, here's $100,000 to build whatever. I don't think they'd be like, oh my God, finally our day. What I'm saying is the effect of that over time made the principal give up. And it was shown in this movie in, I think, a pretty effective way that she had no interest or hope or even expectations of the kids, even internally. And also like the way that they're on this island sort of, I know it's based off of a real island, but it's like the isolation involved and also their unwillingness to even go in the river for fear of drowning or whatever. They sort of like reinforce this isolation physically and educationally. It's just a self cycle, this like downward spiral of isolation and defeatist.
As it turns out, they were right to be skeptical. You know what I mean? They were right. You know, like they didn't want to get their hopes up because they didn't think there was much of a chance. And the moment they do get their hopes up, it turns out there wasn't much of a chance.
Yeah.
Andrew, education in Conrack.
What I got from it was kind of, first off, I kind of agree with just everything you guys were saying. So forgive me if I'm iterative, but I did find it to be about this kind of learned helplessness through just generations of being isolated, through people being completely disillusioned, I suppose.
Before we wrap up, I want to give these. So those are my themes. Was there anything that you guys glommed onto in terms of themes that I didn't mention that you wanted to talk about?
No, I don't know if it's necessarily a theme. I just thought it had maybe to do with a lot about your past doesn't necessarily have to dictate where you go.
And do you feel like that applied to multiple characters in the piece?
Yeah, no, I feel like it applies to the people on the island and Conroy himself.
Spitballing up what you're saying, the past does seem to have tethered both the principal and the superintendent to the ground. Like they seem immovable based on the weight of the past.
Totally. And I think that might be in there to show that it can if you let it. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't necessarily have to, I think. And I think that's ultimately what I took from the movie, whether that's a theme or not. I don't know.
I think it is. It's definitely a theme we've applied to other movies. It didn't occur to me in this particular movie, but I think, as you talk about it, I'm getting excited about it because it does seem to fit. Let's see if Matty P disagrees.
I'm getting excited too, Jonathan.
Don't expound about your excitement, but do you have more to say about how the past relates?
I mean, I do think it's in there, but I wonder if it's a positive or negative result. Like, I think it's saying that your past does dictate where you end up.
Oh, interesting. And he doesn't seem to make a dent. So, like, the ending is cynical, right? For a second, people thought that the past doesn't need to dictate you, but ultimately it does, and there's no escaping it.
And even for Conroy, who might have the best chance of dictating his own future, ends up seemingly not also. He's sort of like doesn't do the thing and then switches careers, whatever you might have inferred.
It is time for us to wrap things up, and I want to give these opportunities for closing thoughts. It's Andrew's very first show. Andrew, do you have a good time?
Yeah. I thank you so much for having me. I would love to do it again.
Matty P, closing thoughts.
It was a great discussion. I think we covered a lot of good ground and had a good time.
Very succinct closing thoughts. That's the way we like it. Next up on the No Name Cinema Society, when we did our 1988 review, you may remember the multiple times I cited the film Wings of Desire from German director Wim Wenders. Next time on the No Name Cinema Society, we'll travel back towards the beginning of that director's career with the black and white film Alice in the Cities. Before that, however, these guys want to say goodbye to you guys. Say goodbye to the audience.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, audience.
There you go, because we have an audio listening audience as well. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, this meeting of the No Name Cinema Society is adjourned.